So the next thing we're going to look at today is what we call trigonometric ratios and their reciprocals. So already you have learned the primary trig ratios. The primary trig ratios are sine, cosine, and tangent. Now these were concepts that were introduced in 10C and also revisited in 20-1. So it is now in 30-1, but not only are these in 30-1, but they're also their reciprocals. And we're going to get into that in just a moment here. First thing we want to do is look at this diagram here. Now this is an angle in standard position, theta, and using that angle, you could produce any type of you can produce a right angle triangle here. So this is actually from 20-1 here. So in this right angle triangle, we have a hypotenuse, which is r. We have the opposite side, which is y. Okay, so it's along the vertical. That's why it's called y. And along the horizontal, we have our x side. Okay, so remember, my sine ratio, so sine of theta is equal to your opposite over hypotenuse. Now that is grade 10. In 20-1, you learned it as y over r. Okay, let's take a look at the next ratio, cos of theta. Now in 10C, you learned it as adjacent over hypotenuse. But it's not called that anymore. In 20-1, you learned it as x over r. And that stays the same in 30-1. Finally, tan theta, you learned it as opposite over adjacent. But once again, that's 10C. In 20-1, you known it as y over x. Okay, and that's going to stay the same for this 30-1 course. But now we introduce the reciprocals of each of these three ratios. And remember, what is a reciprocal? Well, to find the reciprocal of a number, let's say 2, you simply flip it. And that's exactly what we're going to do to each of these functions, or each of these ratios. So this reciprocal of sine theta is simply going to be 1 over sine theta. But instead of saying 1 over sine theta, we're going to denote it as cosecant. So CSC stands for cosecant. And that's what we refer to as the reciprocal of sine. Okay, so secant theta is going to be equal to, well, here is the ratio for sine. When we take the reciprocal of y over r, we're going to flip that fraction. So we get r over y. There's the cosecant ratio. Okay, let's move on to cos here. Cos is 1 over cos theta. Okay, but instead of saying 1 over cos theta, we consider it as the secant of theta. So the SEC stands for secant. And that's the reciprocal of a cosine function. So that's going to be equal to this ratio, but flipped. Okay, so r over x is going to be your secant ratio. And finally, we have the tan ratio. So 1 over tan theta is a reciprocal. But instead of writing that out, we're going to call it the cotangent. So cotangent of theta. Okay, so we pronounce it as cotangent. All right, so once again, that ratio is going to be y over x, but we're going to flip it because we're taking the reciprocal, so x over y. So there are all three of your trig ratios that you have known for 2 grades now, and their corresponding reciprocals. All right, so keep that in mind when you do your assignment. I don't believe it's on that formula sheet. It used to be, but they took it out. So you have to know these. But if you know all 3 of the primary trig ratios, you could definitely derive all 3 of its reciprocals. So there you go. And that's my lesson on introducing to you the trig ratios and their reciprocals.